Okay, think I'm going to get going. I don't see the numbers going up anymore, so hopefully everyone has joined, and if not, they'll be joining in a minute or two. First of all, I'd just like to welcome everyone to the Clean Arctic Alliance's pre-PPR briefing, how to reduce Arctic shipping's black carbon emissions and scrubber discharges. First of all, a couple of housekeeping points. We're going to record the webinar so that we can make it available to those that were unable to join at this time. And secondly, if you have any questions, could you please indicate, if you can, to which speaker they should be directed, and submit them via the Zoom Q&A option, which should be somewhere towards the bottom of your screen. We'll keep all questions until the end of the webinar when we have a Q&A session, but if you can submit them at any time. If we run out of time for questions, we'll take a note of them and we'll try and follow up on any outstanding questions as well after the event. Right, I'm going to get going. Next week, the International Maritime Organization will hold the 9th session of its Pollution Prevention and Response Subcommittee. The meeting will be run virtually, though I believe that some people are beginning to start joining meetings from the IMO's HQ in London. On the agenda, there will be a number of climate and marine environmental pollution issues that are of particular relevance to the Clean Arctic Alliance. In particular, actions to address the use of scrubbers and discharge of scrubber wastewater into the oceans, and consideration of actions to reduce emissions of black carbon from ships burning oil-based fuels, particularly from those operating in and near to the Arctic. First, though, I would just like to start by referring back to some of the concluding words from Hans Otto Portner, one of the co-chairs of the Working Group 2 report of the IPCC's 6th assessment on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, published earlier this month. He concluded by saying, "The scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future." The Clean Arctic Alliance believes that these words must be central to all further discussions of climate overheating and air pollution within the IMO. The changes in the Arctic also impact the rest of the world, because the Arctic serves as a regulator of global climate and of other ecological processes through large-scale patterns related to air and ocean circulation. There is now high confidence that these processes are nearing points beyond which rapid and irreversible changes on the scale of multiple human generations are possible. The magnitude of cascading changes over the next 2 centuries includes temperature extremes, permafrost thaw, and sea ice loss beyond that experienced in human existence. With that, I'm just going to quickly introduce our speakers today and the panel. We will start off with 2 short presentations from the Clean Arctic Alliance's technical advisors, Ilko Leemans and Bill Hemmings. This will be followed by a 20 to 25-minute Q&A panel session, and our speakers will be joined by Sam Davin from WWF Canada and Dr. Lucy Gilliam from Seas at Risk. So now I'm going to hand over to Ilko and Bill. We'll move straight from the first speaker to the second one. So Ilko, you have the floor.
Thank you, Sean. Yes, I see the first slide is appearing already. So what I'm going to tell is about scrubbers, or EGCS, which stands for exhaust gas cleaning systems, which were adopted for use on ships to reduce SOx emissions as an alternative to the IMO-compliant low sulfur fuels. The open loop scrubbers, which account for about 80% of scrubbers installed on ships, and hybrid scrubbers operated in open loop mode, reduce SOx from exhaust gases prior to stack emission using a heavy continuous spray of seawater. The contaminated seawater with SOx and other substances, including PAH and heavy metals, is then discharged into the sea. The closed-loop scrubbers operate in much the same way, but typically use fresh water treated with alkaline chemicals and discharge in a smaller volume or of more concentrated effluent at discrete intervals. And this practice leads to a smaller volume or a more concentrated effluent. This practice leads to aquatic pollution, and therefore several IMO member states have banned the use of these scrubbers in their territorial waters, and environmental organizations believe that scrubber discharge should be banned globally. In addition to polluting the marine environment, ships using scrubbers tend to produce more particulate matter, including black carbon, than ships using distillate fuel. Furthermore, the acidic character of wastewater produced by open loop systems not only exacerbates ocean acidification, but also reduces the ability of the ocean to function as a carbon sink. At MEPC 76 and 77 and PPR 9, various papers were submitted on this issue, including PPR 9-10-4 and PPR 9-INF22, both by environmental NGOs. So the scope of work on scrubbers at PPR 9 will cover, among others, the following issues. To develop a framework, guidelines on risk of scrubber wastewater, to consider impact assessment guidelines, delivery of scrubber residues to port reception facilities, regulatory measures, among others, to develop regulatory measures and instruments and a database with local and regional measures, and to establish a database of substances identified in exhaust gas cleaning systems discharge water. Now I'd like to see the next slide, please. Thank you. So an important submission is the submission from ICES, the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea, which is MEPC 76 in 5, which was submitted last year. And it provides background information on the risks to the marine environment of scrubber discharge and recommendations to reduce the impacts, including the following recommendations. The ideal course of action would be a rapid and complete transition to the use of cleaner, low sulfur fuels, including distilled fuels like marine gas oil, liquefied natural gas, and biofuels, which can then meet the sulfur emission limits without the use of scrubbers. If the above recommendation cannot be achieved, it is recommended to apply other mitigation measures. And until the transition of to the use of cleaner low sulfur fuels is completed, discharge of scrubber water to the marine environment should be avoided. So this is a very important recommendation by this scientific body. Now, the environmental NGOs FOAI, WWF, Pacific Environment, and the Clean Shipping Coalition have also some things which they'd like to bring in. And so what we do, we call the IMO member states to express support for a complete prohibition of scrubbers until a global prohibition on scrubbers is adopted, agree to local and regional measures which should be implemented to restrict scrubber discharges, to develop risk and impact assessment guidelines to prohibit discharges in the Arctic, and to consider conflicts between the scrubber discharges and international legal instruments, in particular, legal instruments such as the United Convention on the Law of the Sea, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and UNFCCC. And this is the end of my presentation, but later on we will have a Q&A session where we can go deeper into this. And I'll hand the floor over to Bill Hemmings.
Hello, everyone. Can you see me?
Yes.
We can hear and see you.
Jolly good. So, black carbon. It's one of those short-lived climate forces we all know a lot about, right? It's not like CO2 and insidious. if you stop emitting a short-lived climate force like methane or black carbon, the climate impact disappears very quickly. And so the IPCC have been stressing tackle carbon dioxide for sure, but also tackle these short-lived climate forces. So black carbon. The key to reducing soot, black carbon emissions from diesel fuels is in fact improving the fuel quality. And I'm going to go into a little bit of detail here, but you know, in most things in life, the devil is in the details. In the case of road fuels, a drastic reduction in the sulfur content was mandated in both Europe and North America to enable exhaust filters to be fitted. Too much sulfur-induced particulate matter clogs the filters. On aviation, recent reports show that soot can be removed almost completely from aviation kerosene. And in fact, the sulfur disappears first, and that's for free, because the higher energy content of the cleaner fuel means you burn less fuel, and so you pay less. MIT in Boston, there is a scent work in the US, showed in 2020 that the incremental cost to produce low soot aviation kerosene, can you believe it? It's just a few cents per litre. And CE Delft in the Netherlands said earlier this month that cutting aromatics in aviation kerosene by 50% may cost as little as 10 euros per tonne of kerosene. Quite amazing. Yet the airline industry opposes all such action. Now for shipping, the most obvious first move is in fact to switch to distillate fuels. These fuels are cleaner already, and they're already widely in use. And indeed, Resolution 342 at last November's MEPC 77 called for such a switch, for it to be voluntary. And the co-sponsors of this resolution last November also made clear that doing so, switching to distillates, cuts soot or black carbon emissions by some 50 to 80%, depending on the type of marine engine. So PPR's task now is clear: to turn this resolution into a mandatory regulation. People also talk about using biofuels in shipping because they also have low or in fact no soot. But as we know, the incremental cost of biofuels is what, 200% at least or more. And I think we all realize that biofuels in any case are not the solution to decarbonize shipping. So the other way, apart from distillates, as with aviation kerosene, is to reduce the aromatics in the fuel. All crude oil contains chemicals called aromatics and polyaromatics, benzene, toluene, stuff like that. Some of these chemicals cause cancer, but they also can help ignition and maintaining high engine compression, which leads to better efficiency overall. Unlike aviation, marine fuels are more complex as they are less refined and contain many more pollutants and heavy fuel oil. So in fact, the second task for PPR 9 now is to work out how to reduce the soot emissions from burning HFO, burning ULSFO and VLSFO by limiting the aromatic content or improving the hydrogen to carbon ratio in the fuel. Means basically the same thing. And in fact, Germany and Finland have already urged PPR to do just this. And civil society has now submitted a paper to PPR 9 calling for this work to be prioritized. It's true that reducing aromatics in marine fuels will require changes in refinery processes to apply more hydrogen. That's both an additional cost and it leads to a refinery CO2 penalty as well. PPR's task must be to examine all these issues and find the right balance between reducing the aromatics, the incremental cost, and engine performance. Fortunately, the refinery and fuels industries have enormous experience in this area, developed over many, many years, starting with road fuels. The question, of course, now for marine is whether they are really prepared to cooperate. And after 10 years of prevarication in the IMO, the question for regulators is whether they are serious and prepared to bite the bullet now and require this work to be done starting at PPR next week. Some people say that a soot standard on marine engine exhaust is actually a better route to pursue than the fuel quality issue. But is it? There are many different marine engines that all perform differently, so it would probably need to be engine standards, not just one standard. And I have to mention here, because I do work on aviation as well as shipping, that ICAO spent 10 years working on such a soot or non-volatile particulate matter NVPM standard for aircraft jet engines. I think you can move to 2 now. Thanks, Sylvette. So they spent 10 years on the standard, and in the end, it ended in failure just a couple of years ago. Why? Because the likely cost of developing new engines to meet higher exhaust or more stringent exhaust emission standards, the cost was found to be prohibitive. But perhaps even more importantly, after testing all the existing engines, they found that soot emission levels varied a lot between the jet engines which are already flying. So under heavy pressure from industry, ICAO stepped back from phasing out any of the worst performing engines, and they developed a separate in-service jet engine soot standard, and amazingly, they passed all existing engines. So the result is that the ICAO non-volatile particulate matter engine standards will have absolutely no effect whatsoever in reducing jet engine exhaust. What a pity. Don't believe me on this. The US Environmental Protection Agency has just recently put a report online saying this. You need to go through it because it's all about putting this ICAO standard into US law. But as you read through it, you will see that they say very clearly that it ain't going to have any impact whatsoever. So I say bravo to Biden's EPA for being open and honest. And the question now is, do we really want the IMO to go down a similarly potentially blind alley on engine standards, possibly delaying action for another 10 years and possibly risking a similar failure? We should all remember that the IMO did act on sulfur. Bravo IMO, giving industry just over 2 years to comply with a global sulfur cap. The question today is, will it now act on soot and aromatics in marine fuels? PPR 9 will set up a correspondence group, and it's essential in that correspondence group that work on reducing aromatics in marine fuels be given a high priority, along with preparations for a mandatory switch to distillates under MARPOL for all ships sailing in or near the Arctic. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilko, and thank you, Bill, for that. I just remind everyone, please feel free to ask some questions now. There should be a button towards the bottom of your screens. I think it's fairly standard on most people's systems, Zoom systems. Pop your question. If you can direct it to one of the speakers, that would be great. We'll put up a slide with the list of all the speakers so that it's easy to see who's who. I'll start off with a couple of questions and bring in our other panelists as well with those, particularly as we've got no questions in the Q&A at the moment, but please feel free to put your questions up there and we'll come to them. I'm going to start off with a question around one of the papers that has been submitted to PPR 9, one of the information papers, which suggests that on a life cycle basis, the use of high sulfur fuels and an exhaust gas cleaning system contributes less CO2, carbon dioxide, to the atmosphere than the use of lower sulfur fuels. So surely if that's the case, it is better from a climate perspective to continue to use high sulfur fuels and a scrubber. And Sam, could I direct that question to you, please?
Of course, Sean, thanks for that good question. So I think the first thing that I would note looking at this paper, and everyone should keep in mind, is that the CE Delft study that underpins this submission was commissioned, in fact, by 3 scrubber manufacturers, and is being put forth by an association whose members have invested heavily in scrubber technology. But that aside, the first thing I'd say is that other studies have shown just the opposite. of what this study is telling us. So for example, if we look at Canada's submission, PPR 9/INF.21, it includes a study that Canada commissioned from the International Council on Clean Transportation. And this study finds that the life cycle CO2 emissions associated with the combined use of scrubbers and heavy fuel oil ends up being actually about 1% higher than the emissions associated with, say, marine gas oil. I would also add that this study doesn't actually model the life cycle CO2 emissions of marine gas oil or very low sulfur fuel oil. Rather, it models a range of fuels at various stages of the desulfurization process. So the claim that the CO2 contribution to the atmosphere when using a scrubber in combination with a high sulfur fuel can actually yield less CO2 to the atmosphere than low sulfur fuels like MGO or very low sulfur fuel oil is misleading. But I would finally just say that even if there were a very narrow range of instances where there would be a life cycle CO2 benefit to using scrubbers with HFO or other high sulfur fuel, there are larger environmental and socioeconomic impacts that would outweigh the benefits of any marginal CO2 life cycle advantage. Now, we need to keep in mind that scrubbers are dumping at least 10 gigatons of toxic effluent into the ocean each year, which has potential not only to affect ecosystems and ocean users, but also compromises the capacity of the ocean to effectively act as a carbon sink. So, Sean, in answer to your question, no, I would say that there's not a climate benefit to scrubbers.
Thank you, Sam. That was very helpful. Still no questions in the Q&A. Please do feel free to submit questions. But Lucy, if I could turn to you now. One of the things I've heard a couple of times in the last week or two is, why are we still concerned about the Arctic? The IMO adopted a ban on the use and carriage of heavy fuel oils in the Arctic last year, and also a resolution, as Bill's referred to, on reducing black carbon emissions by switching from heavy fuels to distillate and alternative cleaner fuels and methods of propulsion. So what is the urgency and why is it that we need PPR 9 to be doing more now?
Brilliant question. Thank you, Sean. So on one hand, the urgency is that the Arctic is warming nearly 3 times faster than anywhere else on the globe, and we've heard about the IPCC report, which has a lot in it about the risks of climate heating to the polar regions, and we're seeing a cascading web of impacts at local, regional level that is driven by the climate heating there. And we've heard already about how black carbon is exacerbating the melting of sea ice and the thawing of permafrost. Add to that, we've seen in recent weeks news reports that the poles are unusually hot for this time of year. So, that's the urgency. The climate is heating and the poles are heating far faster than were originally predicted. So, we don't have 10 years to sort this out. This is an urgent problem to tackle. Now, onto the question of, well, we've got this voluntary distillate switch agreed last year, and we've got the HFO ban. Why do we need to do more? Well, firstly, the HFO ban has a number of kind of waivers and in it, which means that it's unlikely to have impact on reducing black carbon emissions before 2029. So that's one thing is, if we had a full HFO ban now, and that would then lead to a switch to distillates, then we would be solving the black carbon problem. But unfortunately, due to these waivers and exemptions, that's not the case. So we need to do more. On the subject of the voluntary distillate switch, well, it's an excellent signal. It's great that it's agreed, but we need to make something mandatory. And that's what we need to be asking for now when we're at PPR. We need to have a mandatory regulation requiring a switch to distillates. We need to be mandating when you switch to distillates that you're also installing diesel particulate filters, because that means that you can almost totally eliminate black carbon emissions by doing so. And we need to make sure, as Bill's talked about, that we have an aromatic fuel standard as well, to make sure that there isn't sort of an excess of aromatics that are contributing towards soot. So, you know, that's the priority now. We need to go from something that's voluntary to something that's mandatory, because black carbon is accelerating the sea ice loss and it's accelerating permafrost thaw. So, you know, it's having these big global implications. Now, beyond PPR 9, you know, we obviously aren't advocating for ships to stay on fossil fuels forever. You know, we need to go beyond this. We need to establish ECAs, so emission control areas, and we need to be decarbonising shipping in line with the Paris Agreement. So that means ultimately switching to cleaner fuels and taking steps to promote use of shore power import. So, you know, electrification, shore power import, and new fuels ultimately. But in the short term, in the here and now, we need to be getting ships off the dirtiest fuels and eliminating the black carbon. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy.
Sean, if I can just add, you know, it was UNEP and other organizations which brought this issue about the Arctic and shipping back in 2009, 2010. The IMO started work on this in 2011. If I'm not mistaken, that's 11 years ago, and I was almost just out of kindergarten then. How can it be that after 11 years of working on an issue, when we all know the climate crisis is getting more and more, that governments are still talking about voluntary measures? I think that's an amazing situation for us all to be in, given the extent of the climate crisis.
I agree, and I'm not going to answer, you know, my views on this, but we've got some questions. I'm going to pick up on them now. Oh, yeah, thank you. Sorry. The first question that came in was from Hinrich. Hinrich is asking why not implement black carbon limits and continuously monitor the BC emissions as a goal-based measure. Bill, I'll hand that over to you, I think.
Okay. The issue is what limits to start with. And as I said initially, that you know, there are many, many different types of marine engines, different sizes of ships, etc. And they'll all be sailing under different sorts of conditions. And so, you know, setting a limit is going to take a long time. And you've got to set again that challenge and get against the time that's going to take to sort that out, with the indisputable fact, and there were 7 or was it 9 countries in Europe said this in black and white to the MEPC last November, that distillates will reduce black carbon instantly as soon as you start using them, but by between 50 or 80% depending on the ship type. So yeah, we could go down the limit route, but wouldn't you do that after you had taken this decision? And it's not as if distillates are a new fuel. They're probably 15% or maybe more of at least of fuel, marine fuel use in Europe. So that would be my initial answer.
Thank you. Oh, yes, thank you. Sorry, I'm not muted. Ang Sung, I'm sorry, I'm trying to, your question is in 2 parts, so I think I'll try and ask it all as one question, and then again, perhaps Bill and Lucy might like to come in on this. Ang Sung is asking, in the future, can ships that are burning heavy fuel oil reprocess the measure, I think, to meet, or can they use that as a measure to meet the Arctic black carbon emission standards? And then there's a follow-up to that around after treatment measures. Bill, are you able to come in on that, or Lucy, or both of you, one after the other, maybe?
I'm not sure what HFO reprocessing is, Ang Sun, but there aren't any emission standards at the moment, so that's the question I've just answered.
I wondered if it meant, will that measure be sufficient to meet the requirements?
The measure of moving to distillates?
No, sorry, the HFO ban. Will the HFO ban deliver the requirements needed to reduce black carbon emissions in the Arctic?
Well, it depends if the ban is actually going to have any effect. It's not starting till 2024, and you could drive a bus through the loopholes. And in fact, it doesn't actually become mandatory till sometime in 2029, which, if I'm not mistaken, is 7 years away. So we do need the HFO ban, and we probably need to make sure that all HFO under that ban is not used. But again, 2024, 2029, a lot of ships already use distillates. You can switch to distillates literally overnight. You just got to go to a port and load up with the stuff and switch it in the engine.
Lucy, do you want to come in at all?
Well, I was just going to kind of reiterate, because there's a second part of his question of what is the after treatment? Well, when you switch to distillates, then the after treatment is to fit a diesel particulate filter. It's actually, you know, relatively simple. These products are on the market. Distillate fuels are available worldwide. Do we need to look for other solutions when we actually have something that's available that ships can use? And yeah, talking about installation of a filter. So I don't think there are other after treatments. You know, ultimately, we want to make this switch now to reduce black carbon emissions now, while we get on with decarbonising ships so that they're no longer burning fossil fuels. We don't want to spend a lot of time over the next, you know, however many years, you know, further refining kind of monitoring systems in order to deal with a problem where we already have a solution that's available right now. So I think that's something to really kind of, you know, make clear, is that we could get rid of those emissions today.
Thank you. And I'm just going to follow up on that with Katarina's question. Do you know if any ships companies already follow the voluntary switch to distillates? I'm actually going to take the moderator's prerogative and offer something on that, and then I think Ilko might like to come in as well. At the moment, I'm not aware of anyone that is doing so. However, I do know that the Norwegian government have introduced a domestic ban on any ships carrying and using heavy fuel oils in the waters around Svalbard, the island archipelago of Svalbard. So effectively that makes that change happen. But it's through domestic regulation that it has come about, rather than ships or companies voluntarily switching to distillates. Actually, sorry, I take that back. I do know of some examples of ships and companies that are voluntarily switching to distillates, but they had already done so before that resolution was adopted. And certainly there are a number of expedition cruise operators that have made that switch already. Ilko, I think you want to come in though, so I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, I think this is a sort of a general remark that we have to realize that the end goal is to decarbonize shipping, and we really have to keep that target somewhere there, over there, that there will be more regulation. And what I was thinking about, there was one submission, I think, that raised the question: do we really need to get rid of scrubbers? Because we were, 15 years ago or so, or 10 years ago, we were promised that we could use these scrubbers, and because they didn't have any negative environmental consequences. But the new insight shows that indeed scrubbers have negative impact. So then there's a new situation, and we have to deal with the new situation. That means that we have to progress, and that's with many topics in the shipping industry. We have to keep moving forward because shipping in general is not that really clean mode of transportation that it wants to be. So decarbonizing, but also while decarbonizing, making sure that pollution gets not into the marine environment. And yeah, that's a sort of a general thing I wanted to say.
Thank you, Ilko. I've got a question now, actually, that I'm going to direct to Sam, and then we'll come back to Sylvain's question after that. But just before we leave this this issue, I'd just like to note, people have probably seen it in the chat, but Bridget has also added a comment about how we need to also address HFO ban is not sufficient because of the need to move away from low aromatic, very low sulfur fuel oils.
Can I just comment on that?
Sorry, just quickly, Bill. Yes, then I'll come back to Sam.
I mean, that's the 0.5% global sulfur standard, that fuel, right? And you know, it's worth paying attention to the debate, political debate, which is now raging in Europe about reducing aromatics in aviation kerosene, because as I said, if you start to turn up the hydrogen in the refinery, the sulfur goes for free, and then the aromatics start to go. And so PPR and the IMO really need to get their heads around the fact that, yes, we can start to reduce aromatics in very low sulfur fuel, and we'll get further sulfur reductions for free. And that's a huge double benefit.
Thank you. Sam, I wanted to ask again a question that has been raised with me recently, and it's referred to in the paper submitted to one of the papers submitted to PPR next week. If the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea includes a provision that requires states to take measures in a manner that does not transfer pollution from one area to another or transform one type of pollution into another, what does this mean for exhaust emissions and scrubber discharges? Thank you. Sorry, that's rather put you on the spot because you couldn't even see that question in advance. I do apologize.
That's perfectly fine. And thanks for that question, Sean. I mean, so just to back up a little bit, you know, we are of the view that the use of scrubbers is inconsistent with the United Nations Convention Law of the Sea, including Article 195, which you cited. But, you know, in addition, there are inconsistencies with Article 192, 194, and 196, as well as other UN legal instruments that inform the environmental provisions in UNCLOS. So, you know, collectively, in our view, this is putting states who subscribe to these various treaties, conventions, and resolutions in a real policy and legal conundrum. And so it would be our view in this circumstance that the pathway to resolving all of these outstanding issues, including Article 195 that you mentioned, would be to prohibit the use of scrubbers globally. And if I can just take a moment to, since we're on this, you know, one of the really important things that we look at is not only the immediate effects of scrubber discharges on the marine environment, but what impact they have on the climate system as well. And this links into state duties under the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which states a duty to protect carbon sinks and reservoirs. And again, I'd like to raise the issue here is not only the increased particulate and black carbon emissions associated with scrubber use over distillate fuels, but the injection of sulfur oxides into the ocean, which compromise the capacity of the ocean to absorb atmospheric CO2 and thus contribute to offsetting climate change. So again, with all of these legal and policy conundrums, we advise that a switch to compliant IMO fuels is made as soon as possible.
Thank you, Sam. And I think that really emphasizes the need for a more holistic approach so that we're not just transferring problems from one area to another. I'd like to turn to Sylvain's question in the Q&A. It's a very broad question, as you say, Sylvain, and it's not directly about black carbon, but that's fine. And the question is, how is shipping going to be carbon neutral by 2050, as Maersk and others have promised? And is this technically and economically feasible? Lucy, I think, would you like to come in on this first? I'm sure others might want to comment as well, but we'll start with Lucy.
Okay, I can try. I think it is technically possible to decarbonize fully shipping by 2050, but it's not going to be, you know, one thing. We're going to be moving from fossil fuels to ships using a combination of different technologies. So, you know, there are a range of kind of future fuels that are on the table right now. A number of different hydrogen-based fuels. There's, you know, talk of hydrogen, methanol, ammonia, etc. They all have their pluses and minuses. Some of them have some quite significant other environmental impacts. So it's very important when we're looking at fuels of the future that we don't just look through a very, very narrow kind of carbon lens, but that we take on board all of the different environmental impacts of the different fuel choices that we have. But also, you know, electrification can play a role in reducing energy demand and emissions. So there's, you know, there's already a lot of electric or hybrid ships out there. So this technology is already kind of being deployed. So another thing is to actually, you know, use technologies that reduce the amount of fuel that you need to burn in the first place. So technologies like wind devices on ships, or new hull designs or hull coatings that can reduce friction through the water in order to make sure that of whatever future fuel you're using, you're burning as little as possible. So it's going to be a combination of technologies. And there are some that are kind of ready today, but maybe have limitations in terms of scale or range. And there are others that are going to require a little bit more development and also will need infrastructure deployed in order for them to be available for ships. But I do think it is possible. I think a number of the big shipping companies also think it's possible, but there are going to be trade-offs. And I think it's also important to consider not only what are the kind of fuels of the future, but also really think about, you know, what are we shipping? What do our supply chains look like? How much energy is being burned? You know, look at the operations of shipping as well. You know, one of the ways to reduce the amount of fuel you need is to actually slow down ships. We should be using all of these different ways to reduce fossil fuels and to move as fast as we can to alternatives.
Thank you, Lucy. That was very comprehensive. I do have one more question. We are running up against the time barrier. And I see there's another comment just gone into the chat as well. Unless anyone's got anything desperate they want to add to that now, I'd like to maybe move on to the last question I've got here, but then I will just check the chat and see if there's one more question there. One of the things that I've been asked actually in the last few days is a question that comes up quite a lot actually as well, I think, is that there's a lot of discussion around engines and standards and the different parameters that have a bearing on the amount of emissions from engines. And one thing in particular is around engine loads and the types of engines and the speeds of ships. Bill, would you be able to just add some clarification on what needs to be done, or what the implications are of different engines, different engine loads? I know you touched on it in your presentation earlier, but maybe you could just add a little bit more on engine loads. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, as Lucy said, and it ain't new and it ain't novel, and it's pretty obvious that one way to save fuel, whether you're driving a car or whether you're riding a bike, is to go slower. And it's the same obvious thing for shipping, even though when this was brought to the IMO about 10 years ago, everyone was shock horror. So if you do slow your ship down, then you might go down to a lower engine load, and you do have to then be careful because the black carbon emissions might increase. And so there's very good knowledge out there that you may well need to retune your engine if you're going slower. But the other thing is, no matter how fast or slow the engine goes, if you put a cleaner fuel in there, which is going to emit less nasties, including black carbon, ipso facto, you're going to reduce the pollution. So I think that would be the reality.
Thank you. And I see the comments, sorry, from Heinrich and Eddie about proper combustion control being important too. Sam, I think you wanted to come in.
Very briefly, thank you, Sean. Just to build on Bill's comment about engine load. Engine load is directly correlated with the amount of scrubber wash water that's being produced in discharge as well for open loop systems and hybrid systems being operated in open loop mode. So again, through speed reductions, you can also achieve a reduction in the amount of pollution that scrubbers are depositing directly into the ocean and cutting back on the issues that we raised during Elko's presentation. Thanks.
And just on engine load, and I see something on old engines. I mean, it's like the Euro standards in Europe. If you have an old engine or an old car, eventually you're not going to be able to drive it. And it's a bit same with ships. And Bravo Industry actually made some suggestions in the IMO, particularly in the Arctic, that there'll come a time when an old clunker won't be able to sail in the Arctic. And I think that's, I mean, you can retrofit old engines, you can do that, but you can't expect to drive old dirty engines forever, particularly in a place like the Arctic.
Thank you, both of you. We are out of time, I'm afraid, so I'm just going to take a minute or two to wrap things up. As I said at the start, it's our intention to make the recording of the webinar available, particularly for those that were unable to join us today. Sylvette, if you could just go on to the last slide or two, please. That would be great. Thank you. We'll circulate the details in the next, well, hopefully by the end of the week. It's Thursday already, so hopefully by the end of the week. So if anyone does want to refer back to it again, you'll be able to, but also so that people who couldn't join us at this time are able to review it as well. I would like to just thank the panelists today, Ilko, Bill, Sam and Lucy. Thank you very much. And also thank you all of the participants for joining us and also for your questions as well. I hope that everyone on the call today has found today's discussion useful ahead of next week's meeting. And I hope that many of you will be able to be there and contribute to the discussions and hopefully make some progress on addressing both of these thorny issues, reducing black carbon emissions in the Arctic and reducing and eliminating discharges of wastes into the ocean. Thank you very much.